bass's element. This is where they live. You know, it's where they breed, make babies, eat, feed, their whole life. So one of the things that an eddy, well, that structure affords, is it creates eddies. It creates water currents. It creates these areas of dead water. Now, we always tend to think of bass when they're feeding. You know, great pictures is bass up on the surface with their eyes down, chewing on things. What do bass do the rest of the time when they're neutral? They want to rest. Well, they're not going to rest in a raging current. They're going to rest in some place that doesn't have current. They don't want to have to swim a half an hour to get to, you know, quiet water. So prime structure will have the eddies that produce these dead water spots right next to fast water. This way these fish can sit there when they're feeding and just float around in the eddy, and when they see something that goes by they want, out they go. When they're not feeding, they just want to rest, they're there. They ain't very far from where they feed, so they don't have to expend a whole lot of energy to get back to it when they decide to feed. So eddy is all important. It's what structure is about. Example on the top, bottom drop. Okay, current runs over a drop. What typically happens, and I have a friend who dives who sort of clued me in on a lot of this stuff too. So the water just kind of hooks around over there. I mean, again, I'm not a physicist and I can't really give you, the whole skinny on fluid dynamics, other than to say that typically this is what happens with current. Runs over a hole, it creates sort of a dead backwash. These fish can get down in there and just float, and not have to work too hard. They're right in the midst of the current. Stuff's getting swept right over their head, and they don't have to work too hard to stay where they are. Same thing with a rock. A couple things happen with rocks and rises. The water rushes over, you get this action on the back side. It rushes around to either side, and you usually get a folding effect. That creates a real dead area of water back there for those fish to rest in and feed from. One that I didn't put up on there that a lot of people don't pay attention to is a ridge. It's the reverse of a drop. I have 2 or 3 spots that I fish that basically the bottom comes up rapidly. There's a bar that sits in the middle of it. And typically that's sort of the antithesis of the type of spot that most people are looking for when they're fishing, when they're looking for structure. But what happens there, again, with the eddy is that, you get all this water coming up, banging itself against this bar. Well, it's got 2 places to go. One is over. And by the way, the bass will get up in there when they're actively feeding because it really confines the area that they have to look for bait. And they can handle the current, so they're up there looking around. But when they're not, they're off on the sides because a lot of that water is going to look to go around. When it goes around, it creates these little spin-off eddies on the side of it. These things are all subtle. And it sounds like I'm spending a lot of time on something which is rather trivial. It's not. It's what makes the whole thing work. You can find these, and again, they can be small and they can be stacked with bass. And you can cast on either side of them, and when those fish are neutral, they ain't coming out. They're not going to come out and chase your plug or your bait, whatever it is that you're using. So the reverse ridge is not unlike the rock. It produces eddies around the side. On a larger scale, bottom left-hand side, you got a bend in a channel elbow. These are great spots, channel elbows. What happens is the water, when it's running, a particular thing, tends to want to, I think Newton said, whatever's in motion tends to want to stay in motion. It wants to go straight. And what happens is it smacks itself up on the far shore. And that creates sort of a back pressure. Inevitably, on almost every channel elbow, you'll find a small area on this side of it that you get a water spin. Most people would look at it and go, and they walk right by it. That edge between the moving water and the water spin is a place that bass will hang out because they can sit back there when they're not feeding, and then they can watch what's going by. They can rest. Bass have to rest. They're not always on the feed. So what they're doing when they're not feeding is just as important in finding them as what they're doing when they are. coves and cuts and channels, the same thing happens. You get a backwash of the current as it goes by. These can be very small. I have a favorite spot that's on the backside of an inlet. Very little minor rock cove. Most people walk right by it. It's a deep little hole. It's like a whirlpool. It doesn't matter whether the tide's going in or out. It just makes this whirlpool all the time. I'll sit there. You were asking about live mining and stuff, you know, from a boat. I live mine a lot from places like that. I'll go catch a shad. I'll walk the shad up and I'll lob the shad right out there and I'll let him go right around in that whirlpool. Swim around and around and around and around. Sitting there. All of a sudden, bang, you know, the big fish are there. You're feeding.